There are moments in life that feel ordinary on the surface, yet something inside you knows they are not. You wake up, scroll, listen, and suddenly a word lands deeper than expected. It doesn't just pass through your ears, it settles in your spirit. This is one of those moments. What if the struggle you thought would never end was not stretching endlessly forward, but quietly reaching its final boundary? What if the delay, the resistance, the emotional exhaustion you've been carrying was not a sign of failure, but evidence that something irreversible has already happened within you? Throughout history, Scripture reveals a pattern that many overlook. God rarely ends a season by changing circumstances first. He ends it by changing the person inside the season. Before the Red Sea parted, fear had to give way to trust. Before Jericho fell, obedience had to mature into alignment. Before David wore a crown, his identity had to be forged where no one was watching. And now, here you are. Not by accident, not by coincidence, but at a threshold that feels heavy, sacred, and strangely quiet. This message is not built to stir emotion for a moment. It is designed to speak to awareness, the kind that reshapes how you see yourself, your past, and what comes next. Because there are cycles that do not end when the enemy retreats. They end when permission expires, and permission expires the moment you become someone the old pattern can no longer recognize. In this series, we will not rush. We will walk carefully through what it truly means when Scripture speaks of appointed time, refinement, identity, and awakening. We will examine why pressure intensifies just before release, why silence often precedes clarity, and why transformation always begins inward, long before it becomes visible outward. This is not about predicting tomorrow. It is about understanding who you have already become. If you have ever felt like life kept circling the same lessons, if you have wondered why certain battles felt personal, precise, and relentless, if you sensed that something inside you shifted before anything around you did, then stay with this message. Because what you are about to hear is not about escape. It is about arrival. And once awareness rises, the cycle cannot survive. Part 1. Divine Timing and the Law of Spiritual Thresholds. There is a profound misunderstanding about timing in the spiritual life. Many people believe that breakthrough is scheduled by dates, seasons, or external events. They wait for a calendar shift, a sign in the sky, or a sudden change in circumstances. But Scripture reveals something far more subtle and far more powerful. God's timing is rarely chronological, it is transformational. In the Bible, the phrase often translated as the right time or the appointed time does not describe a day on a clock. It describes a moment when readiness and purpose finally meet. This is what Scripture calls divine timing. Consider this carefully. If God released deliverance the moment pain began, growth would never occur. If rescue arrived before identity matured, freedom would collapse under immaturity. That is why God often allows a season to continue long after we feel finished with it. Not because He is absent, but because something inside us is still forming. A spiritual threshold is crossed when the inner posture changes. Before Israel crossed the Red Sea, fear had to be confronted. They were physically free from Egypt, but mentally still enslaved. The sea did not part because time passed. It parted when trust finally outweighed terror. Before Joshua saw the walls of Jericho fall, obedience had to mature beyond logic. The strategy made no sense. There were no weapons raised, no siege formed, no negotiation attempted. Just consistent, faithful obedience. The breakthrough did not respond to noise. It responded to alignment. This is the law of spiritual thresholds. What cannot change, you cannot continue to hold you. Many battles last longer than necessary because they are no longer about the enemy's strength. They are about the believer's awareness. The struggle remains active only while it has access. And access is not granted through sin alone. It is granted through unrecognized identity. That is why certain cycles persist even after prayer. Not because prayer failed, but because the version of the person praying has not yet shifted. Scripture teaches that God does not merely remove obstacles. He redefines the one walking through them. This is why some seasons feel repetitive, not because God is testing patience, but because He is refining perception. When the mind begins to change, the atmosphere follows. When identity aligns, resistance loses its authority. This explains why the most intense pressure often arrives just before transition. Not because you are about to lose, but because you are about to outgrow the battlefield. The enemy does not fight endings, he fights awareness. Because once you recognize who you are becoming, the cycle no longer has permission to repeat. Divine timing activates not when heaven decides to move, but when the believer becomes capable of standing where heaven already moved. And this is where many people misunderstand delay. Delay is not denial. Delay is development. God does not waste pain. He uses it to deepen roots, sharpen discernment, and mature authority. A plant exposed too early to open air cannot survive. A structure rushed without foundation will collapse under weight. And a calling revealed before identity forms will become a burden instead of a blessing. This is why Scripture repeatedly shows transformation happening in hidden places. Moses was shaped in the wilderness. Joseph was refined in confinement. David was formed in obscurity. Jesus himself withdrew into solitude before public ministry. Hidden seasons are not pauses. They are preparation zones, and when preparation is complete, the threshold appears. Not with noise, not with drama, but with clarity. Suddenly, what once triggered fear no longer holds power. What once demanded explanation no longer requires defense. What once drained energy no longer has access. That is how you know the threshold is near, because the battle does not feel louder. It feels irrelevant. Divine timing reveals itself when the question changes from, "How do I survive this?" to, "Why does this no longer fit who I am?" And once that question rises, the cycle is already ending. Part 2. Pressure, refinement, and the formation of identity. Pressure is one of the most misunderstood tools in the spiritual life. Most people interpret pressure as opposition. They assume that intensity means something is wrong, that resistance is evidence of failure, or that exhaustion signals disfavor. But Scripture consistently reveals a different truth. Pressure is not designed to destroy you. It is designed to define you. In the natural world, nothing reaches its intended form without pressure. Diamonds are not created in comfort. Gold is not purified without heat. Strength is not developed without resistance. The same principle operates spiritually. God does not apply pressure to see if you will break. He allows pressure to reveal what cannot remain. This is why certain seasons feel heavy, precise, and personal. They target reactions, beliefs, emotional patterns, and internal narratives, not just external behavior. Pressure exposes identity gaps. It reveals where fear still influences decisions, where approval still shapes choices, where past wounds still speak louder than truth. Refinement is not punishment, it is alignment. In Scripture, refinement always precedes elevation. Before Joseph led nations, his integrity was tested in private. Before Peter strengthened others, his self-confidence had to collapse. Before Paul carried revelation, his old certainty had to be dismantled. God does not elevate unrefined identity, not because He withholds blessing, but because He protects purpose. An identity built on performance cannot sustain authority. An identity built on approval cannot withstand criticism. An identity built on comfort cannot survive calling. This is why refinement often feels like loss before it feels like gain. Certain attachments must loosen. Certain illusions must dissolve. Certain false sources of security must fail, not to leave you empty, but to make room for something stable. Pressure strips away what you leaned on but could not carry you forward. And this is where many people misunderstand spiritual pain. They assume that because something hurts, it must be wrong. But Scripture shows that some pain is not injury. It is transformation. When a muscle grows, it tears before it strengthens. When a seed grows, its outer shell must break. When identity matures, old versions must die. This is not cruelty. This is necessity. Refinement is the process by which God ensures that what comes next does not crush you, because blessings arrive with weight. Calling carries responsibility. Influence demands stability. Without refinement, favor becomes pressure. Without maturity, opportunity becomes overwhelm. That is why God often delays visible reward until invisible work is complete. You may have noticed that during intense seasons, familiar coping mechanisms stop working. What once numbed pain no longer satisfies. What once distracted no longer helps. What once motivated no longer moves you. This is not regression, it is graduation. Your soul is being retrained to draw strength from deeper sources. Pressure teaches discernment. It trains you to recognize the difference between urgency and importance, between noise and instruction, between reaction and response. And slowly, something changes. You stop explaining yourself. You stop chasing validation. You stop fearing misunderstanding.
Not because you no longer care, but because your identity no longer depends on agreement. This is the mark of refinement. Identity begins to stabilize internally instead of externally. And once identity stabilizes, the environment loses control. People often ask why resistance increases right before breakthrough. The answer is simple. Pressure intensifies because the old version is losing influence. The enemy does not attack what he already controls. He resists what is slipping beyond reach. Refinement threatens patterns. When you no longer respond the same way, when you no longer react on impulse, when you no longer shrink under pressure, the system that relied on your predictability begins to fail, and failure produces friction. This is why pressure peaks before release, not because God is hesitant, but because transformation is nearly complete. Identity is forming, and once identity forms, authority follows. Because in the kingdom, authority does not come from position. It comes from alignment. You cannot stand in new territory with an old self-image. You cannot carry new responsibility with unresolved identity. You cannot steward freedom without internal order. Refinement builds that order, and when the process finishes, something unmistakable happens. The pressure lifts, not because life becomes easy, but because you become anchored. You no longer move from fear. You no longer decide from insecurity. You no longer react from wounds. You respond from truth. And once that happens, the cycle you feared losing becomes the season you outgrew. Part 3. The silent shift. When awareness changes everything, not all change announces itself. Some of the most decisive moments in Scripture arrive quietly, without spectacle, without applause, without immediate confirmation. They pass unnoticed by others, yet they alter everything. This is the nature of the silent shift. A silent shift occurs when awareness changes before circumstances do. Nothing outside looks different, but something inside has moved into alignment. And once awareness shifts, reality is forced to follow, even if it lags behind. Most people wait for evidence before they believe something has changed. But Scripture reveals the opposite order. Belief reshapes perception. Perception reshapes response. Response reshapes outcome. That is why Jesus often said, "Your faith has made you whole," before any visible proof appeared. Awareness is the doorway through which transformation enters. When awareness rises, you begin to see patterns instead of problems. You recognize triggers instead of reacting to them. You observe emotions without being ruled by them. This is not emotional detachment. It is spiritual clarity. The silent shift happens when you stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What is this revealing about me?" That question alone dismantles cycles, because cycles survive on unconscious participation. The moment you recognize a pattern, it loses power to repeat automatically. Scripture teaches that darkness cannot overcome light, not because light fights harder, but because darkness cannot remain once light appears. Awareness is light. This explains why certain struggles end not with victory celebrations but with indifference. You do not conquer them. You outgrow them. They lose emotional charge. They lose narrative weight. They lose authority over your decisions. What once consumed mental energy now passes without attachment. This is the silent shift at work. Many people mistake this stage as stagnation. They say nothing is happening because nothing dramatic is visible. But inwardly, authority is reorganizing. Your nervous system begins to calm. Your response is slow. Your discernment sharpens. You pause before speaking. You listen before reacting. You choose before responding. These are not small changes. They are foundational. Scripture shows that God often completes his work in silence. Elijah did not hear God in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire, but in a still, small voice. That voice did not overwhelm. It clarified. Clarity is evidence of alignment. The silent shift also explains why some relationships feel different before they actually change. You begin to notice imbalance without resentment, distance without bitterness, disconnection without panic. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped clinging. Awareness loosens unhealthy attachment. You no longer chase what does not choose you. You no longer explain yourself to those committed to misunderstanding. You no longer overextend to maintain proximity. This is not hardness. It is health. Silence replaces striving, and with silence comes discernment. You begin to sense when a door is closing without forcing it open. You recognize when a season is ending without demanding closure. You accept when a role no longer fits without defending your exit. This is the maturity Scripture describes when it says, "Those who are led by the Spirit." Being led does not always feel powerful. Often it feels peaceful. The silent shift also affects how you perceive opposition. What once felt like an attack now feels like confirmation. What once felt threatening now feels predictable. What once provoked anxiety now invites prayer or nothing at all. Because awareness breaks intimidation. The enemy thrives in confusion. He loses ground in clarity. That is why awareness is often resisted. It dismantles manipulation. It exposes false urgency. It interrupts emotional hooks. And once those hooks lose grip, cycles unravel naturally. You do not need to fight what no longer controls you. You do not need to escape what no longer defines you. This is why the silent shift is so powerful. It ends seasons without announcement. It closes doors without confrontation. It releases burdens without explanation. And when the external world finally catches up, people say, "You've changed." They are right. But the change happened long before they noticed, because awareness moved first. And once awareness moves, the rest is inevitable. Part 4, When Permission Expires. Why cycles end without warning. Most people believe cycles end because something external changes. A person leaves, a door opens, a situation collapses, an opportunity appears. But Scripture reveals a deeper reality. Cycles end when permission expires. Permission is not always conscious. It is often granted through tolerance, agreement, or unchallenged belief. As long as a pattern has access to your reactions, emotions, and identity, it has permission to remain. The moment that access is revoked, the cycle cannot survive. This is why some endings feel sudden, not because they happened quickly, but because they were completed internally long before they manifested externally. Permission expires quietly. It ends the moment you stop negotiating with what drains you. It ends the moment you stop justifying what diminishes you. It ends the moment you stop returning to what no longer aligns. Scripture repeatedly shows this principle. Pharaoh lost power over Israel not when Moses confronted him, but when Israel finally walked out without looking back. The prodigal son's captivity ended not when circumstances changed, but when his awareness returned. Jesus stripped the enemy of authority not by force, but by refusing agreement. Authority flows where agreement exists. The enemy does not need dominance if he has consent. He does not need power if he has permission. That is why cycles often persist even after prayer, fasting, and intention, because permission has not yet been withdrawn. Withdrawal of permission does not require confrontation. It requires alignment. When you no longer react the same way, when you no longer internalize the same narratives, when you no longer tolerate the same dynamics, the cycle begins to destabilize. This is why some patterns intensify briefly before ending. They sense the loss of access. A pattern without permission will attempt to provoke a reaction. It will exaggerate. It will repeat itself louder. It will try to trigger old responses, not because it is stronger, but because it is losing relevance. Scripture teaches that the enemy prowls, seeking whom he may devour. That phrase implies limitation. He cannot devour everyone, only those who grant access. When permission expires, proximity does not matter. You can be near something without being affected by it. You can encounter old triggers without re-entering old cycles. You can face familiar pressure without reverting to familiar responses. This is spiritual authority in action. Authority is not loud. It is settled. When permission expires, endings happen without closure. You may never receive an apology. You may never get an explanation. You may never see accountability. And yet, the cycle ends. Because closure is not required when alignment is complete. This is where many people struggle. They wait for the other party to change. They wait for validation. They wait for acknowledgement. But Scripture never places your freedom in someone else's response. Freedom is internal. When Jesus was rejected, he did not argue. He withdrew. Withdrawal is not weakness. It is discernment. There are doors God closes not by locking them, but by removing your desire to walk through them. That is how permission expires. You lose appetite for what once consumed you. You lose energy for what once drained you. You lose interest in what once defined you. This is not loss. It is release. And release often feels anticlimactic. No dramatic exit, no final conversation, no grand declaration. Just a quiet recognition. I am done. And once that recognition settles, the cycle cannot restart, because permission is no longer available. Scripture calls this renewal of the mind. A renewed mind does not argue with temptation. It does not negotiate with dysfunction. It does not revisit old agreements. It moves forward. When permission expires, God does not need to remove the enemy. The enemy removes himself, because access has been denied. And this is why some people wake up one day and realize something has ended without remembering the exact moment it happened. It ended when alignment replaced tolerance. It ended when awareness replaced reaction. It ended when identity replaced insecurity. And once that happens, the cycle is over, permanently. Part 5, Crossing the Threshold. Life after the cycle ends. When a cycle ends, life does not immediately become easy, but it becomes clear. Many people expect fireworks after breakthrough. They anticipate instant joy, visible reward, or dramatic confirmation. Yet Scripture shows that the first evidence of a new season is not excitement, it is stability. After Israel crossed the Red Sea, the wilderness still awaited. After David was anointed, obscurity continued. After Jesus overcame temptation, ministry unfolded gradually. Crossing a threshold does not remove responsibility. It redefines capacity. Life after a cycle ends feels unfamiliar at first. The chaos you learned to manage is gone. The urgency you adapted to has faded. The emotional intensity that once fueled your decisions no longer drives you. This quiet can feel unsettling. Some people mistake peace for boredom. They wonder if something is missing. In reality, something unnecessary has left. Peace is not the absence of activity. It is the absence of internal conflict. After the cycle ends, you begin to notice how much energy was previously spent on survival, explaining, defending, overthinking, recovering. That energy returns to you, and with it comes discernment. You choose differently now. You pause before committing. You listen before responding. You evaluate alignment before investing. This is not hesitation. It is wisdom. Scripture calls this walking in the Spirit. Walking implies movement without force. Life after the cycle also reveals new boundaries, not walls, boundaries. Walls are built from fear. Boundaries are built from clarity. You no longer need to announce them. You simply live within them. People sense the shift. Some will respect it. Some will resist it. Some will remove themselves. This is not rejection. It is sorting. Thresholds reorganize relationships. Not everyone can follow you into a new season. Not because they are bad, but because alignment has changed. Scripture shows that even Jesus left certain crowds behind as his mission progressed. Movement requires release. After a cycle ends, obedience becomes simpler. You no longer wrestle with every decision. You no longer analyze every step. You recognize direction internally. This is the fruit of alignment. God's guidance becomes less about instruction and more about resonance. You feel when something fits. You sense when something is off. You trust what settles rather than what excites. This is maturity. Life after the cycle also reveals new kinds of opposition. Not resistance to who you were, but challenges appropriate to who you are becoming. Old battles fade. New responsibilities emerge. And this is important. Freedom is not escape from pressure. It is capacity to carry it without collapse. After the cycle ends, pressure no longer shapes identity. Identity shapes how pressure is handled. You are no longer proving. You are stewarding. This is why Scripture often speaks of stewardship after deliverance. With freedom comes responsibility. With clarity comes accountability. With authority comes humility. Crossing the threshold does not elevate ego. It deepens dependence. You recognize that growth did not come from strength alone, but from surrender. Life after the cycle is not louder. It is deeper. Your prayers change. You ask less for rescue and more for alignment. You seek less confirmation and more consistency. You desire less control and more faithfulness. And slowly, you realize something profound. You are no longer trying to become someone else. You are becoming yourself. The version of you that survived the cycle is not the one that crossed the threshold. The one who crossed was formed quietly, patiently, intentionally. And now you live from that formation, not rushed, not reactive, not afraid, rooted. And when new challenges arise, because they will, you meet them from stability, not survival. This is life after the cycle, not perfect, not painless, but aligned. Conclusion: the end was the beginning. Many endings do not feel like endings. They arrive without announcement. They pass without ceremony. They leave no clear marker in time. And yet, they divide life into before and after. What you have just walked through was not about escaping hardship. It was about becoming someone who no longer belongs to it. Scripture never promises a life without pressure. It promises a life anchored in truth. The cycle did not end because circumstances finally cooperated. It ended because you changed. Awareness replaced confusion. Alignment replaced tolerance. Identity replaced insecurity. This is the pattern God has always used. He does not remove his people from every storm. He transforms them so the storm no longer defines them. You were not delayed. You were being developed. Every moment of resistance refined discernment. Every season of silence sharpened listening. Every unanswered question deepened trust. Nothing was wasted. The pain that once felt personal became purposeful. The struggle that once felt endless became formative. And now you stand in a different posture, not demanding explanation, not waiting for validation, not negotiating with fear, standing in clarity. The end you feared was not loss. It was release. Release from versions of yourself that could not carry what God prepared. Release from patterns that relied on your unawareness. Release from cycles that thrived on reaction instead of truth. What comes next may not be immediately visible, but it will be sustainable, because God does not rush what He intends to last. Scripture says that those who wait on the Lord renew their strength. Renewal does not mean returning to what was. It means rising as someone new. You are not starting over. You are continuing forward with wisdom gained, boundaries formed, and identity secured. The door closed because you no longer fit through it. And that is not rejection. It is direction. So do not look back searching for confirmation. Do not revisit what has already released you. Do not doubt what alignment has made clear. Walk forward, quietly, faithfully, anchored, because the ending you survived was the beginning that prepared you. And the cycle that once defined you now stands as proof that transformation is real and permanent.